In this lesson, we'll be going through structuring in a case interview, and it will be made up of two parts. In part one, we'll be going through why you need to structure, in what situations you need to structure, and the high-level principles that you need to follow. And then, in part two, we'll be going through how to apply the concept of being messy as you do this. Okay, so structuring. This is one of the most challenging dimensions to master because it really tests your problem-solving skills and is crucial for solving any case. But you can definitely get there with enough targeted practice. So, what does it actually mean? Broadly, you can think of structuring in case interviews in two ways. One is creating a structure, and the second is being structured in how you communicate. This lesson will be focused on creating a structure, and you can watch other videos to help you with structured communication. Creating a structure, in simple terms, is just the process of breaking down a problem into smaller parts that can be analyzed individually. Once all of these parts have been analyzed, the findings can then be put together to solve the original problem. It's kind of like having different puzzle pieces that look totally different, but then when they're slotted together, they reveal a complete picture. This part is important to consulting firms because it reflects how they approach real-life projects with their clients. Clients are often huge, multi-billion-dollar organizations with super complex issues, and consultants have a short space of time to solve their problems, usually around 6 to 8 weeks. So right at the beginning, we create a roadmap of how we're going to tackle the problem and how to get to an answer. In other words, we build a structure. It's super useful because it drastically reduces the risk of wasting time and energy on things that aren't important for the case, aka boiling the ocean. So, in case interviews, there are two types of scenarios where this will be tested. The first is at a well-defined stage of the case, right at the beginning when you've been given your client brief. A brief might be something along the lines of, your client is the CEO of a coffee shop retailer called Ground Up, with 80 stores in 11 different countries. The company had been experiencing consistent year-on-year growth, but this has plateaued over the past 2 years. The client has come to you for help on how they can improve their situation. You should ask a few clarifying questions using the BOLT method, and then take a couple of minutes to think about your key question, potential hypothesis, and lay out your structure. And then the second scenario is in the middle of your case interview. You would have already presented your initial structure, and you'll get asked a shorter, more specific question about the case to see how many ideas you can come up with and how creative those ideas are. So, in that sort of case, your question might be, could you suggest how the coffee shop, Ground Up, can increase customer footfall into their coffee shops? Before we move on, I should mention that these questions often feel quite conversational in an interview, and this means you may feel the urge to immediately reply to prevent an awkward silence or any kind of disruption in the flow of conversation. Do not fall into this trap. The interviewer 100% expects you and wants you to take a couple of minutes to think. Your answers and your presentation will come across 100 times more polished, so do yourself justice and ask for time in these type of situations. All right, okay, so the approach we use to break down these big problems is building an issue tree, which may also be called a hypothesis tree, a driver tree, a framework, etc. This is a very useful tool to logically break down problems in a systematic way and to create a detailed map to help you get your answer. Okay, so in an interview, you start with your piece of paper landscape. Here on the left, you have a box. Inside the box is your key question or hypothesis, which we'll call X. Then you split X into 2, 3, 4, even 5 smaller issues to look into. Let's just say 3 for this one. So then we draw 3 branches and we call them issue A, issue B, and issue C. It's quite clear that if you add A, B, and C together, they make up problem X. And there you have the first layer of your tree finished. But one layer isn't detailed enough to make this a useful map. So you really need to break things down into a second layer. So then we'll take each of these 3 smaller issues one by one, top to bottom, and use the same principle to break them down into even smaller sub-issues. So for A, this could be made up of issues A1, A2, and A3. And then for B, you can have B1 and B2. And then for C, you can have C1, C2, and C3. And there you have your second layer of your structure. Now, if you wanted to break things down to a third, fourth, or even a fifth level, you could simply follow the exact same process of taking each part of the layer individually and segmenting it until you get down to the level that is specific enough for you to analyze. Okay, so you know the theory now. Let's use a simple example. I want you to imagine that you've decided to go on a walk, and you're wondering if you should take an umbrella with you. The key question is therefore, should I take an umbrella? Your hypothesis depends on the question, and for a should we type of question, a decent hypothesis is you should do X if Y is satisfied. So my initial hypothesis might be, yes, I should take an umbrella with me if I'm going to be exposed to rain. All right, so then you have 2 options. You can write your key question up on the side here, and then use your hypothesis in your box as X. Or you can put your key question in box X and then mention your hypothesis as you're presenting your structure. This doesn't make any difference to the actual framework. Just try both ways and see what works best for you. For this particular example, let's start with the hypothesis here in our box, and that is yes, if exposed to rain. Your structure should follow on very naturally, and it should group the details of what you need to know in order to test that hypothesis. So, keeping things high level, the first bucket I would want to consider to test my hypothesis is, of course, the probability of rain exposure. But remember that your hypothesis won't cover the entire problem, just one important aspect. You have to think about other areas as well. So the other buckets I want to consider is my capability to take the umbrella with me and the risks or alternatives I should think about. And there is my first layer. So let's move on to the next one. Starting with probability of rain exposure, I'm going to break this down further into 2 buckets: exposure and environment. So, looking at exposure, I'm going to break this down further. Here, I would want to know how long will my walk be? And what % of the walk will I be exposed to the open sky for? And then for environment, I want to know, has there been any rain recently? What's the trend for rain around this time of year? And what does the weather forecast predict? Similar breakdowns can be made for the other 2 buckets, so pause here and give it a go yourself. So then, under the capability bucket, for my second layer, I would want to know, 1, can I physically carry the umbrella? 2, do I know how to use it? For the first part of my third layer, I would want to know, what is the size and weight of the umbrella? Do I have a bag to carry it? And do I have the strength to carry it? Then for do I know how to use it? I'm wondering, is this an umbrella I already have and I'm comfortable with? Or is this some sort of new, fancy, high-tech umbrella that's really complicated to use? Okay, so finally, with the third and last bucket, I'm going to split this up into risks and alternatives. For my third layer, for risks, I'm thinking about 1, the level of inconvenience to me if it doesn't rain, 2, the consequences of my getting wet, and 3, the likelihood of my losing the umbrella. And then for alternatives, there's of course the option to not take anything, to take another form of protection like a raincoat or a cap. And then also there's the option to just cancel the walk altogether. Now that we've filled in all of the branches, you can see it really looks like a tree, hence the name issue tree. You can see that each layer has 2 to 3 breakdowns, which is a good reference number, especially for the first level. But don't think of it as a strict rule. Sometimes you may have lots of questions, and other times you just might not. But if you're getting to more than 5 or 6 buckets, you probably would want to think about adding another layer before to group some of them up, like I did with my risks and alternatives bucket. You can also see that I've broken down my tree into 1, 2, 3 layers. For an initial case structure, 2 to 3 layers is a pretty good guide to have to make sure you get enough detail, but also are time efficient. Okay, so then taking a step back here now, it's super important to lay out your structure clearly on your piece of paper, similarly to what I've done here. A clearly laid out issue tree will help you keep track of what areas you've already considered and how each piece of analysis links back to the original problem. So let's start with how I would use this tree to analyze my first bucket. Okay, so how long is my walk going to be? Let's say it's going to be about 1 hour. And then what percentage of the walk will be exposed to the sky? Well, I'm going to be walking around a lake with no covering, so 100%. So I can cross these two things off. Then I want to move on to weather forecasts and trends. I find out that it actually rains a lot over this time of year, and the weather forecast is predicting rain. So now I can cross off these branches too, which means I can cross off this whole bucket and have come to the conclusion that there is a high probability of rain exposure. Then you use your structure to guide you on where to go next, your capabilities. So there you have an example of an initial case structure. Now, if you remember, there are 2 situations where you'll need to create a structure in your case interview. And the second is when you're asked to generate some specific ideas or solutions. These are called brainstorming questions. And here, you'll be using exactly the same fundamental skills and tree structure to come up with solutions, rather than breaking down issues. Using a tree might seem like a rigid way of brainstorming ideas, but actually, it allows for greater creativity and more solutions because thinking in a structured way forces you to consider all of your possibilities. Let's take another simple example. Say I was asked to name all the possible ways I could travel from the UK to France. Pause the video here and see how many ways you can think of without using any form of structure. So, off the top of my head, I can think of an airplane, a car, a ferry, a helicopter, a motorbike, a train, a truck, and a bicycle. 8 ideas. Not bad, but imagine if it were a tougher question and you had the pressure of an interview and your interviewer asked for even more ideas. How I communicated these ideas made them seem very random, as if I just said the first thing that came to the top of my head, which was exactly what I did. A consultant needs to be able to justify every single idea that they have to their client. But to do that convincingly, ideas need to make logical sense and the client needs to be able to follow their train of thought, i.e., the ideas need to be structured. So let's try this again using a tree this time. Pause here and try it yourself. So, I put my key question here on the left as transport modes from UK to France. Now, before I offer any ideas, I'm going to take a moment to see how I can split this up into smaller parts in a McKinsey way. For my first layer, I'm going to split up the categories into land, water, and then air. First of all, looking at land transportation, I'm going to split that up into machinery, animals, and human. And then I'm going to split up machinery into rail and road. Moving on to the next bucket then, water, I'm going to split that up into above water and below water. And then air, I think, is fine just as it is. Now I have my structure laid out, I'm going to start generating ideas. So starting from the top, I'm going to think of land travel using some sort of machinery. So starting with rail, I'm thinking of trains and trams. Then for road, I'm thinking of cars, trucks, and motorbikes. Moving on to animals, you've obviously got horses. But now that I'm really thinking about more specifics, I could say by camel or even by elephant. Obviously, these options aren't the most plausible, and you would definitely want to mention that. But it's showing some out-of-the-box thinking. And then finally, in humans, I'm going to say walking, running, and swimming. Using the same method, I would then follow one of these trees one by one to come up with more answers. So you can see that I set up my problem-solving framework before I offered any solutions, and how I was able to focus my thoughts to come up with some creative ideas. The beauty of this is that sometimes interviewers push you for more and more ideas to test your method. If you don't have a structure, best case scenario, you'll come up with maybe 3 or 4 more ideas. But worst case, you'll sit there and think, oh my gosh, I've literally just given all my ideas. I can't think of anything else. But if you have a structure, all you need to do is simply go back to the end breakdowns and think through them again. So in this case, any more transport methods by rail? I can't think of any more. But by road? I haven't mentioned a bicycle or a caravan. Then for animals, I could also mention a donkey or even a sled and reindeer. And then for humans, I could say skipping or jumping. And then I would do the same thing for the rest of my structure and come back with even more answers. Again, you can see that my structure has different levels at different points. Up to level 1 here, level 2 here, and then level 3 there. When you're setting up your structure, you want to try and get to at least level 2 and a maximum of level 3 to get the really detailed and specific answers. You might get away with only 1 level, but only in some really high level or ambiguous questions. All right, so now we've been through the scenarios where you would need to create a structure. To summarize, here are some core principles that you should try and follow when you build out your trees. Number 1, break down your first layer and then take each branch one at a time to the level of detail that you need. 2, there's a balance you need to hit between getting the right level of detail, i.e., the number of layers, versus time, and this comes with practice. 3, every breakdown of every layer needs to be messy. This means being as mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive as possible. And 4, every bucket should add insight and get you closer to solving the problem. There are a number of different ways to break things down, and understanding the most meaningful ways comes with practice. So that, in a nutshell, is how you should think about laying out your structure in a case interview. In part 2, we'll be covering how to break down the layers in a messy way. If you're unfamiliar with this concept, then please watch the video, What is Messy, before part 2.